Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Sam and this is The Lonely Chapter, a show where we speak to interesting people, finding out their stories, discovering what motivates them, whilst also learning from their highs and their lows. Today we are learning from Chris Burnett. He is the founder of That Conversations movement, and on the back of that, he's also written a book detailing his journey. Chris aims to inspire people all over to have more in-depth and meaningful conversations with people in their lives. Thank you for listening. This one was made for your enjoyment. Chris, I want to learn a little bit more about you growing up to start with. Were conversations something you always did throughout your childhood and into your adolescence?
Look, I wouldn't say in such an in-depth and meaningful way as we'll come on to that I've been doing more recently, but I've always been a very social and extroverted person. So I've always had friends from different sort of friendship groups throughout school, and I was always pretty confident in terms of speaking to adults as well. And I always found myself in amongst my kind of friendship groups being somebody to sort of take initiative, decide on what we were doing, or open the kind of hold that kind of diplomacy, if you like, of like asking people what they wanted to do and then sort of figuring things out. So I've always been quite the conversationalist, I would say. But it wasn't until kind of lockdown really triggered for me time to go and sit and reflect and then get into more deeping, meaningful conversations. But yeah, growing up, definitely the social kind of extroverted kid. Having said that, people that know me as a kid have since told me that I was quite I've always been quite aware of how I was perceived by others, and wouldn't necessarily go off and do my own thing. I would kind of ask around and see if anyone else was kind of keen to do something before I kind of committed to doing it, which is funny because that has kind of completely flipped on its head sort of later in life, where I've just kind of taken the initiative myself to go and move abroad, being kind of the biggest example, but just kind of put myself into new situations. And that's, I've learned that that's surprised people that knew me as a kid, in terms of how, I guess, adventurous I've been with those decisions and kind of doing things for myself.
You spoke there about moving abroad. Was that before or after lockdown? At what point was that?
Yeah, before. So my first kind of proper experience of going abroad was I did an Erasmus semester at uni. So this is back 2012, 2013. So I was in my second year of uni undergrad, and I went to Malta for 5 months.
Okay.
And I guess the inspiration behind that was I had grandparents who'd done a lot of travel, and I was just in awe of like their stories of having gone and explored the world, and then every time they'd come back from trips they'd have photographs to show, and they have my grandma still has this map on her wall, with loads of like a map of the world, loads of pins in it. And I remember watching my granda like place pins every time they came back from trips, and just being so curious about that. And I think that gave me a real kind of inspiration to want to explore the world. And going to uni, it was very much like I chose the uni I went to basically because they emphasized the opportunity to study abroad. And I was like, yeah, I'll have a bit of that basically. And it was from kind of inspiration from grandparents. And so once I did that and took the kind of plunge and went on that experience, it really just opened my eyes to, okay, hold on, the world is a big place, and how cool is it not just to travel places, but to actually go and live places for a little while. So I've done a few things since, and then my most significant move was like 18 months before lockdown, I moved out to Melbourne. So that's where I ended up during the lockdowns.
And yeah, lockdown was quite a difficult time for everyone. And obviously being abroad, the other side of the world, essentially, it's even more difficult potentially. What was it like for you in that moment?
Yeah, it was. Look, it wasn't all bad, I will say. Especially the initial sort of 2-3 months, we had a lot of fun. So I was in a big share house at the time. There were 6 of us, and most of us were international. So we were all kind of in a similar boat to that extent. And we had a great time, to be honest. We just played a bunch of cards, board games, Taskmaster, the show. We did our own version of that show. Like, it was just
Love
a
that.
lot going on, and it was a lot of fun. However, Melbourne was one of the most one of the strictest places in terms of lockdown throughout the world, and that kind of really came home to roost, I guess, 6 months in, let's say, when it just got a bit tiresome, and it was so strict. Like, we're talking 5 kilometer radius, 8 p.m. curfews. You're meant to only go out for an hour a day, and you went to always wear a mask. Like, it was just, yeah, the kind of the strictest of the rules, which was a good thing at the time, I thought, because, you know, it was actually seeing numbers try to go down, and they were trying to go for an elimination strategy. Anyway, 6 months in or so, it just got a bit kind of on top of everybody, and in particular myself. I was really struggling with homesickness and just feeling very disconnected from everyone back home, and I was really struggling at the time as well. I was having to do quite a bit of writing. I was studying at the time, and things were just getting on top of me because I couldn't, like, I was sitting working in my room, and then, like, I didn't have a space to go. It wasn't the biggest of house, despite there being 6 of us, and I just became a bit of an arsehole, to be honest, to my housemates, and I've since kind of really grovelled and apologised to them. But what that meant as well was I was in quite like a dark space myself, and yeah, I think homesickness and disconnection were two of the big causes, as well as just generally being in lockdown for so long and it being so strict. And I guess as well, you know, thinking about that sort of rough time as, like, let's say July, August. Everyone back home, it's summer, and things were starting to open up, versus, like, in Australia it was, like, quote unquote winter, and so even being able to go out, like, they weren't opening things up as quickly because the weather wasn't that great, and you couldn't have, you know, outside seating and all of that in a lot of places. So yeah, it was a bit of a struggle, I'm not gonna lie, but that's kind of where I then sort of had myself kind of a bit of self-reflection, and was reading a lot, and read Tuesdays with Maury, which I don't know if you've come across, but it's a beautiful little book. No. It's about what's important in life. Would thoroughly recommend it. I read it in one sitting, which I wouldn't recommend because it's quite like an emotional roller coaster. So I was, like, weeping by the end of it because I was just so engrossed in this book. Anyway, had this feeling from that of, like, okay, I need to do something with this, because, as I say, it talks about what's important in life, and one of the key things in that was, like, connection. And essentially, without going into the book too much, it's essentially about a guy who sees his old uni professor on the news, who's it's a true story, who's dying, and so he goes back to visit him, and he ends up going back to visit him to discuss what's important in life, because the professor Maury has, I guess, I mean, he's obviously an incredibly intelligent person anyway, but has this kind of newfound perspective almost, because he knows he's only got 6 months or a year, whatever it is, to live. And so I was reading that, and one of the messages in that, among many others, was that, you know, connection and deep relationships, that's what's really important in life. Like, yeah, you can have all the prestige and all of the money and etc., but, like, if you don't have strong ties and stories to kind of reminisce with people, and then what's the point, really? So that's what I took from the book. And as I say, at the time I was feeling quite disconnected, and so it just really resonated and felt like, okay, I need to do something with this. And that's where I started having a bit, like, these more kind of intentional conversations with family and friends.
Yeah, it sounds like that book sort of came into your life at the right time, I suppose.
Definitely.
And reading that and listening to that story and the things that the book had in it, a lot of the time we can read and we think, oh, that's a good idea, that's a poignant point, but we don't necessarily act on them. So what made you want to actually take from that book and then act on that?
Yeah. Look, I think people would agree that I'm always someone who isn't afraid to try something and sort of take initiative, which I guess, you know, going back to what I was saying before, like, me as a kid might not have been that person. I really relied on having the kind of security and the knowledge that other people were getting around this idea before I committed to something, versus, like, you know, later, once I got to university and beyond, like, it just kind of, I would take risks, I guess. I would take more initiative. And so, and I think that was very much exemplified. So the way I started this was I decided to start having a call a week to catch up with someone that I hadn't spoken to in a while. So that was my way of kind of reigniting connection. And we were in this time where, throughout lockdown, people were used to kind of just jumping on a Zoom call or, you know, whatever. And it was, you know, people were doing quizzes online and things. It wasn't like a total foreign concept to have all these video calls. So that was very much my way of countering homesickness. And I guess, you know, me taking initiative and stuff, that was very much exemplified. I had a few friends who, once we had the call and they were kind of asking, so what's this all about? And I was telling them, well, it's kind of this project I'm trying to start, a call a week. And they were like, oh, this is so you. And yeah, that's kind of how it started. And I guess in terms of why I went that direction, I'm not entirely sure. I think I was already having a couple of calls, catching up with some people that I hadn't spoken to in a while, and it was really lovely. And then I read this book and was like, okay, I need to make this into a thing. And so, yeah, that's probably why it kind of went down that route. But basically, I did that for a year, and I got into this really nice rhythm of having a call a week to catch up with someone. And these are people that I hadn't spoken to in anywhere between 6 months and 6 years. So some people it had been a long time and there was loads to catch up on. And, you kind of have these fleeting glimpses of people's lives through social media, but you don't actually know what's going on in their life until you actually have a conversation with them. So that was really cool. But by the end of that year, I was like, well, I don't want to just like go round again and chat to people. So I thought some of the conversations I'd had along the way had been quite deep into a topic, or we'd like reminisced about something, and I'd been sort of very lightly journaling throughout, just taking notes of who I've been chatting to and what we kind of chatted about.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe there's something in this of like having a bit more of a deep dive into people's lives and learning things about them and about myself as well. So I started these kind of deeper, more intentional conversations, which are essentially like podcasts, like what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
Sit down with a microphone with the person I'm chatting to, record it. But the key thing is that that's not public. So that the recording is just between me and the person I've chatted with. If they want to share it with other people in their lives, that's great. But like for me, it's like, this is just a private recording. And I kind of fell onto a bit of a structure where sort of 3 parts to the conversation. The first part is I ask them questions about their life, which is normally the longest part. And I do leave it open. They can ask me things too, but most of the time it's me asking the questions. And it goes from what were you like as a kid right through to like what you're doing now and beyond. Then the second part is we swap affirmations. So we swap 3 words which used to describe one another. Okay. And I think that probably just came about a bit of inspiration from like having been to a few like friends' birthday parties where like people had kind of said, right, okay, compliment circle time. Let's go around and everyone say something that they like about the birthday person. And, 9 times, if not 10 times out of 10, that was instigated by a female friend. And I thought that this would be kind of an interesting thing to do with guys as well. And it has proven that way, which we can get into if you want. But then the third part of the conversations are a trip down memory lane. So beforehand, I asked them to write down not only 3 words that used to describe me, but also to write down experiences and memories that come to mind when they think of me. And I do the same. And then we just go back and forth and chat about memories, experiences, which, when you do that with friends that you've known for a long time, is just incredibly funny. And, there's just so many stories that come up, and stupid nights out and holidays and all of this that just come to the fore. And what's really interesting about that part is, there's a couple of things. So one is that like I'll write down things that my friend is like, oh, I've totally forgotten about that, but now you mention it. Oh, that's great. And we place different significance on our memories. So like one of my best mates, he had this memory of like us playing football together when we were at school as being like a breakthrough in our friendship. And I was like, had like forgotten about that time. Like that to me isn't where I kind of see our breakthrough in the friendship. So even just like how, you perceive things slightly differently. And then, the other thing is that it's just an incredibly fun thing to do, right? Like this is, typically positive memories, not all, but typically positive memories. And it's just funny to see how, and really interesting to see how a friendship has grown over time, and how it's like there's these milestone memories along the way. So those are kind of the 3 parts. Ask them questions about their life, swap affirmations, take a trip down memory lane. And I just got into a real habit of arranging these sort of podcast deep dive conversations. And haven't really looked back since, to be honest. It's been like, it'll probably go down as the most significant thing I do in my life, I reckon.
Yeah, high praise. It's really good. And yeah, I like the way that you split it up into 3. I think that's a really nice way to do it, because you go for that deep dive, do your affirmations, and then you've got also a bit more fun bit. Like you said, you forget memories and your mate will say something, and then remember that. Great. You sort of relive those together. But yeah, speaking to people in that in-depth way, obviously having started this podcast quite recently is something that I've realized, probably wasn't my main intention going into it, but just how much people have to talk about and how interesting they really are. and yeah, all the backstory of their lives essentially. What skills do you think you've learned from doing this?
Yeah, I think listening skills have to be up there, conversational skills as well. When I say listening, I mean real, like, deep, intentional listening. So, I've done loads of interviews as a academic and as a researcher, and I think it's slightly different than doing it with. There are similar skills you bring across, but it's slightly different doing it when it's just asking about someone's life, and it's having to get out of that mindset of like what's the point in all of this. And like usually when you're doing research, you have a set, like a set interview guide, so a set of like 10 questions or whatever, and you're trying to like get a person to say certain things, or like you can already kind of map out the themes and things, versus like this deep dive. I made it very deliberate from the start that I had 6 or 7 bullet points that would remain consistent, but the real like magic of all of this is in the kind of follow-up questions, and just hearing people tell stories about their life and just letting them go. And just, there is no, I always say to people, there's no rabbit holes here. Like, you can just go and go and go, and like that's all great. Like, if you're telling me something, that's obviously important. And so yeah, the set agenda is just to get to know more about this person's life. And so I think, yeah, listening in terms of really letting someone go on for a few minutes and then kind of have a little follow-up question, and just, noting that in the back of your mind to then bring up again, oh, so you mentioned this earlier, could you tell me more about that? I think that's really where that's a real main skill that's been honed. I'd say as a conversationalist as well, because as I said, I leave this open. People can turn the questions on to me. So I've ended up chatting about my life loads as well throughout. I mean, I've recorded 75 of these conversations.
Awesome.
And so there's been, and not every time I've answered things, but quite a lot of the times I have a few friends who are really good at just going, no, hold on, I've answered the question, now it's your turn, and like flip the question back onto me. And so I've ended up chatting about my life. And actually two of my old housemates, two really good friends, they sat down and sort of put me in the hot seat one night, and it was just me speaking for, ended up being like 3 hours, which kind of shows the amount of shite I can speak. But look, I think being improving me as a conversationalist for sure. And I guess empathy is a real main skill I've kind of gathered from all this as well, because I'm so much more aware of like what goes on, or what has gone on in people's lives. And I think that, there's friends that you have that there's been things in their life that so I can think of like a couple of friends, for example, where I'd known that they'd had significant loss in their life, but I'd never really asked them about it, because I guess we maybe weren't that close, or we've only just met in the last few years. And it's, doing this was a way of, I never put pressure on people to open up, but everybody was always keen to open up. And just learning about their situation in a lot more depth has increased my empathy tenfold, I would say, just being able to sit and listen, and it allows me to then put myself in other people's shoes, metaphorically, going forward. So yeah, I'd say listening, conversationalist skills, and empathy, probably the main ones.
Awesome. 3 really good sort of skills to learn and to continue to hone in. You spoke as well about journaling. So you journaled a bit about what you'd spoken about, and after the calls as well. What do you think that brings to it? Why not just have the conversation and be done? What do you think the journaling adds to it?
Yeah, great question. There's a few things. So one is that I was journaling. So this is when I was doing the calls to catch up with people, and I would open the journal before we had the call, and I would write down how I know the person and when the last time we spoke was, which is a really interesting exercise to try and work out some of the time. You're having to like scroll back through old messages and stuff and be like, when was the last time I actually had a call with them? Not just exchange a few messages, because let's be honest, that's not actually catching up. So, that was interesting. And then afterwards, I would just note down what we spoke about, and maybe a little reflection on, who they are. And it's like one of the reflections was like a mate who I just forgotten how absolutely hilarious he is. And I'm like, oh, I just definitely need to speak to him more, because it just brightens my day anytime we do have a call. So I think the journal is more like, it's more like an artifact for me. I've since gone back over this has been a few years now, and I've gone back and read through that journal. And it's just a lovely thing to like, oh, I remember I had that call with that person. And, it might not be people that I'm necessarily that close to, but it might just be a reminder when I go back to then reach out to them again. And that's actually happened a few times as well. And I also was noting down any time someone kind of gave me any sort of advice, or maybe not even direct advice, but were just talking about their own life. And I was like, oh, I like the way they've kind of talked about that or approached that. So for me, it's almost like there is like a little self-help type of book there in that regard too, but it's people from my life, right? And so it just means that much more when it's more personal. So yeah, a few things there on why the journaling. I think at the time as well, because the first calls obviously were just to catch up, they weren't recorded or anything, and I just wanted a note of like who I was speaking to and how I know the people, and it just makes you think back to all the experiences you've had through your life. And been incredibly lucky to live abroad a few times and meet so many amazing people from all over. And yeah, it was just a way of like kind of, you know, writing that down is a way of sort of committing it to my history, if you like.
Yeah, and also I suppose it takes you back in time. So you've got the recordings, which are the in the moment thing, but then the journal, I suppose, can be like that. Your feelings straight after. What did you then think at that time? And it takes you back to that moment in time for what you were feeling, essentially, regarding that. What I wanted to ask was, obviously, anyone listening who wants to start having these conversations, what would you say? What would you tell them to do?
Yeah, look, it's I've had this chat quite a few times with friends who've said, like, especially those that I've sat and recorded with, they're like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I'd love to have a similar chat with, you know, a friend or a family member or whoever. And people always jump to older relatives. And I guess, you know, I've been very fortunate that I did something similar many years previous with my granddad, and he's since passed. And having that audio recording of him talking about his life is just an incredibly valuable thing. And I've since recorded both my grandma's and, you know, have those on record as well. And so I think people jump to that because it's about, you know, writing down, getting stories and maintaining stories. And, you know, when you do listen back to an audio recording, purely audio, to me, it's like even more visceral than a video would be. I can't quite explain it, but like, because obviously a video, you're seeing the person as well. But for me, an audio, you can just, your imagination takes you back as if you're literally in the room at the time having that conversation. And so there is an element of that. What I do respond to people and say is that, like, people have stories now. You don't need to wait till later in life. People have so many stories now. And for me, it's like, I'd love to, you know, in 5 years' time or whatever, go back and record again and there's other, you know, stories that can come into it. I think the biggest advice is just to have a go and record one. As I say, I'd recorded 75 of these. The first 10 to 15 were very different from kind of what happened moving forward. I hadn't really fallen on the structure when I first started, and they were very short. So I say very short. They were all about an hour to an hour and a half versus like most of the calls after or chats after that were 2.5, 3 hours, because I ended up introducing more questions. I kind of got into the rhythm and the flow of it. I didn't really know what I was starting with. I was just starting with a general timeline of people's lives. You know, what were you like as a kid? How was primary school? How was high school? What did you do after school? Tell me about your career to date. What's next for you? Like, you know, you can see those bullet points. You can ask everybody those questions. And I just kind of went from there. And the kind of real in-depth follow-up questions kind of more emerged as I had more of these conversations. I guess the difference for someone listening to this and thinking about doing something themselves is I've now written down the questions that I ask. So I've got a website, conversationsmovement.com, and people can download little activity guides from that. And literally there is the questions that you can ask if you want to have a similar chat to this. And I think it's just about having a go, and you have to get over a little bit of awkwardness to start with, because there's the awkwardness of like the people you're asking being like, oh, why are you asking me this, that, like, you know, to do this? Like, I had a few people say to me, oh, my life's not interesting. Like, and I think we're in this, it kind of comes from this like celebrity culture that we live in, where every podcast you listen to, it's always like a super, like a high famous celebrity that has the most interesting story apparently. But if you think about it, if you wanted to ask someone a bunch of questions about their life, like maybe you would go to a celebrity, but if you sat and asked your friend about their life, that's going to be incredibly interesting. And it doesn't need to be for anyone else's purposes. Again, my recordings that I've done, keep it private. Like that would be my
Yeah.
advice as well. Keep it private. And therefore, like, you go into it with like, what's the motivation here? Well, my motivation was I wanted to get to know my family and friends on a deeper level. So if you have a similar motivation, then it's very easy once you keep it. If you keep it private, you don't even need to record it. To be honest, you could just take notes or whatever. But again, I would strongly recommend people with the audio recording, and people can just use their phones these days. You just have a voice memo on your phone, plonk that in the middle of the table, and it's not the best, highest audio quality, but that doesn't matter again because it's only you and the person listening, or the person you're chatting to that would be listening back. So I think, yeah, keep it private and just go for it, to be honest, with one, and know that it will be a bit awkward to start with, and you're trying to find your rhythm and find your way of, it might be a bit too structured to start with. You might just be like, ask a question, then ask another question, then ask, and find it difficult to really do the follow-up questions and that kind of thing. Also be open for, if you want to do this, for people to ask you things in return. I think that's very important too,
Yeah.
is to be open to that. So yeah, that's a few things scattergun, but a few bits of advice there, I think.
Yeah, really good advice. I think just doing it is sort of the key thing, isn't it? And just accepting that it will be a bit awkward at times. And like, again, you spoke about there, like everyone's got an interesting story. Everyone's got stuff that you can still learn from. And doing this, speaking to one of my closest friends on one of the other episodes, who I've known for 20 odd years, and still finding out new things that we've just never spoken about, because you don't sit down when you're at the pub or his house, whatever, you don't sit down and have these conversations. So yeah, it's really opened my eyes, and that's why I sort of like resonate with a lot of the stuff that you're saying here.
Yeah.
So yeah, you've given some really good advice on sort of how to get started. Someone's thinking, yeah, maybe I can do that. What can they expect to get out of it? What might help them just go for that in that last bit?
Yeah. As well, I'll just add that I think in terms of who you start with, probably just pick your closest friend, and there's probably going to be less awkwardness there. And yeah, maybe just go with that. I think a lot of people would love to have these conversations with their family, and I would say, yeah, that's been an incredibly valuable thing for me. But maybe you want to build into that. So maybe you just start with a couple of really close friends and go from there. Also, you don't need to do 75 of these. Like I've been saying to people, you can just do one or two. Like, it might not be for you. You might sit down and do it and then go, actually, this wasn't for me. And maybe there's other ways that you can approach this that are more your thing. Like I'm not very prescriptive about this. You can just take my questions, change them, edit them, do it your own way. In terms of what you get out of it, I mean, first and foremost, you learn more about your friends and family, but also about yourself. So having, a bunch of these conversations, you end up being asked questions yourself, you end up reflecting on things. And, if you do the affirmations piece, you end up learning so much about yourself. Because if you imagine, like I've had 75 of my family and friends each give me 3 words that used to describe me. And it's really interesting to see where there's overlap and themes start to emerge. And then you're like, well, okay, well, if so many people are saying that, then I must be that kind of person, So there's so much to learn about yourself. I think one big thing that comes out of all of this as well is you end up deepening your connection, which then allows for more vulnerability, and I guess it normalizes having difficult conversations in the future. So it's not just about the sitting down and doing the big deep chat at that time. It's also then what happens subsequently. So I think especially I've noticed this with guys in my life, so sort of male friends, is that we've never had much vulnerability before, and then we've sat down, done this, people have opened up in ways that I didn't expect, and then later on it's meant that we're able to have chats about our mental health and get to the actual real, like how are you? I'm a bit flat, or whatever that may be. That's just come about way easier and more naturally because we've had this deep dive and it's opened up kind of that vulnerability. So there's a kind of aspect to vulnerability and mental health here as well. But one bit that I always kind of come back to, and that I think is a crucial part of all this, because this whole project for me has been 50% wholesome, deep dive, fun. 50% wholesome, vulnerable, and then 50% fun. And I think coming back to the fun bit, I don't ever want to lose sight of that, because I've had some of the most hilarious conversations I'll ever have in my life through this as well. Not only from people telling me stories about their childhood and growing up and stuff, and you know, especially with like people I've come to know later in life. So I've not known anything about their childhood and them telling me all these stories, but also like, you know, my mum, dad, aunties, uncles telling me stories about them in childhood. And like, you know, there's so many stories that are just hilarious to hear from them. But also when you do the memories activity, as I've said before, when you know someone for a long time, there's so many stories that come up, and you know, a lot of it is not for public consumption, and that's again good that it's private. But there are so many, especially from holidays and trips and stuff, so many tales that I've now got a permanent record for. And if I ever need to blackmail any of my family and friends, then you know, I've got so much dirt, which is brilliant. But then again, there's dirt on me too, so maybe that's a bad idea. But look, the point is that to not lose sight of, this is an incredibly fun thing to do as well. It's not just about the profound, wholesome goodness, which is, don't get me wrong, massive part of it too, but also there is just the kind of the more silly fun side of it too, with just hearing stories. And I think one example is my friend Al. So we met when I lived out in Australia. He's Australian. So, you know, we met when we were both late 20s. And sitting down and hearing stories from him, from his childhood, from going to uni, from meeting his now wife, Chrissy. I was at their wedding a few months ago, and people were telling stories about Al during the speeches and stuff. And I was sitting there like, I've heard this story from him. Like, and it was hilarious because, you know, there's a public version of the story, and then I know it, like the kind of the gory details behind it all. And I think that just really was like, at the time I just sat and thought, yeah, this is really a really nice outcome from my project, is that I know him on a deeper level, to the point where when I was at his wedding, I knew all of the stories that were coming up. And I couldn't say the same for like friends that had known him for a similar amount of time. But obviously now they know the stories, and now they can get the juicy details from them. But just having taken the time to sit down with him, that's just one example of like how I deepened a connection. And then it meant that I had a really lovely kind of internal reflection when I was at his wedding, and just felt like a real sort of, almost felt like a bigger part of it as well, even, you know. So yeah, that was one example among many, but one that was top of mind.
Yeah, it's good to hear that you have that conversation, the in-depth conversation, but then it has that payoff later on. So along the line, like you said, the vulnerability, and I think that's a massive thing at the minute, especially in men, but everyone as well, just in terms of mental health and just speaking about that. So yeah, that's good that helps with that. I just want to ask about, so the conversations you have are recorded, you keep them to yourself. What made you want to take the movement, or create the movement, I should say, and then take that message out to the world?
Yeah, so the point of me writing my book last year was I'd done 75 of these chats, and I had people asking, how do you do it? And I thought, you know what, I'll start writing, and I was going to write a few blog posts. And then it kind of fell into, well, maybe this is a book, and ended up self-publishing a book. And the whole point of that was to encourage others to do something similar. Again, it doesn't have to be the whole hog. It doesn't have to be all 70, like do 75 of these. It just has to be, just think about having more intentional chats with family and friends. What I kind of found was that people enjoyed the book and enjoyed the project, but there was a bit of a gap between that and them actually taking action. So I have a few friends who went and, like, I have one friend who went and called his like great aunt and asked her questions about her life that he'd never asked before, and like had this amazing chat, and she loved the time that he'd taken to ask. And so there's a few examples like that, but generally speaking, people kind of read the book, enjoyed it, and then, you know, that was it, which is great. Like, I'm very appreciative of that. But also the whole point was to get people to take action. So then I was like, right, how do I make this more, this probably needs to be more practical. People are probably looking at this and going, geez, he's done 75 of these. He's interviewed people before. He knows what he's doing. I don't know what I'm doing. How do I, you know, start this? And so the movement, so that conversations movement, has kind of just naturally spawned based on the book. And it's essentially me bringing things to life in a way more practical way. So there's a couple of things. So I've now started a podcast of my own, which, just to plug one podcast and another, but basically it is just me chatting to a friend. And the episodes are 20, 30 minutes, and each episode there's a topic and a question. So it's similar to the initial recordings that I've been doing, except that these are new conversations, obviously for a public format. But it's essentially me just chatting to a friend. So, like, for example, one of the episodes, the topic was laughter, and the question of the episode was, who in your life makes you laugh regularly? So I asked that to my friends. They answered. They asked it back to me. It was a two-way chat, and that was it. And that's it for every episode. So it's just me chatting to a different person every time, and there's a different topic and one question. And the idea being that I then pose the question to the listener of, if you fancy having a similar conversation, why don't you ask that question to someone in your life?
So each time they get a new question, yeah.
Exactly. And so that's one thing. But for me, that's just really just to lift the lid on it all. That is just a way of me continuing my own project, and having more conversations with my family and friends. And so as long as I'm doing that and enjoying that, the podcast will continue. Yeah. So that's the podcast. But the real main thing is events. So we're kind of just in the real early stages of this, but I've ran a couple of these so far. And essentially the events are me bringing to life two of the activities from my own intentional conversations, and having other people do those with their family and friends. So they're held in like a pub or a cafe, very informal, maximum of sort of 20 people. So basically 10 pairs of people. So when you attend an event, you have to attend with someone you know. So you have to bring along a friend or a family member. And then essentially I or whoever is hosting this facilitate you participating in a couple of conversation activities. So you are asked to write down 3 words you use to describe the person that you're attending with, and then you get 10 minutes to back and forth swap those 3 words and give a bit of a justification. And meanwhile, there's 9 other pairs potentially of people in the room also having that similar chat. And then there's a break, and then we come back, and then you write down experiences, memories that come to mind when you think of this person, and you get 20 minutes to take that trip down memory lane. So as I mentioned, part 2 and 3 of my kind of bigger deep dive conversations start bringing that to life a little bit more and making it a lot more actionable for people to just turn up to this event, have this chat with their family and friends. And my hope is that some people would then want to do that again, either in their own time or to come back to another event and bring someone else. Because, you'll do the same activities, but obviously it's going to be a different conversation. So, as I say, just getting that off the ground. I've ran a couple. I was living out in Canada up until recently, so ran a couple there. Did one back in Aberdeen in Scotland when I moved home a few weeks ago. And we've got ones coming up in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And in the last month, I've had a bunch of conversations with probably like 15 to 20 people in different locations around the UK and beyond who might want to run these, because my whole thing is that this is a movement. So in order for it to be a movement, it needs to become autonomous of me, right? It needs to go beyond me. And this event could happen anywhere at any time. And so I've been trying to find people who might want to host these where they are. And essentially the kind of the agreement is that they get all the ticket money. And I manage the admin in terms of the Eventbrite and the social media. And because, like, for me, it's not about money. It's just I want people to have more people to have these conversations. And as I say, for it to become a movement, it needs to be autonomous of me. So it needs to be this ripple effect where people are just doing things themselves. So that's all very new, but really that to me came about because the book I felt wasn't as practical or actionable as I tried to write it. And so this is like another way of kind of approaching that. And the difficulty is that people don't really know what these events are. It's kind of a bit different. Like having to attend with someone is a bit different. Yeah. And people are just reluctant to buy tickets for things that they don't know what it is. But out of the 3 events I've ran so far, literally everyone has said, I didn't really know what to expect, but I'm really glad I attended. I really enjoyed this. And people have said I would come back, or I would want to have similar chats, or I know people who would love this. And so I know that it's just a case of persevering, getting my family and friends in the room for the first few events, and then, word of mouth is the key. For sure. Is the key thing, really.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. It sounds like a really good thing that you're doing there and creating. And like you said, it's a movement, so it's going to go much further than just the first few events. And yeah, excited to see where that goes. With the book, so reading that, there was loads of quotes and little snippets of each conversation that you sort of sprinkled throughout it, which was really nice. Have there been any conversations in particular that have stuck with you for any particular reason?
Yeah, so just, I guess it's important to mention, so in the book, basically the book is in 2 parts. The first part is me explaining the project, and the second part is then content from some of the conversations. And I've gone back to people and basically anonymized the quotes and gone, is it okay if I use this? So, because initially the recording was just private. And to be honest, everyone has said yes. I guess in terms of other conversations, I mean, it's really difficult. I mean, they've all been really interesting and fun, and some have been way more like emotional and vulnerable and stuff, and that's amazing. And some have just been laughing for half an hour, and like, so there's different ways of approaching this in terms of it's impossible to say, oh, this one conversation was the one. But look, there's a few significant ones, which is why like the content in the book point to probably some of the more significant ones. Like I chatted about being bullied in primary school with my dad. Like that was a real significant moment in our relationship. There's friends that have shared with me, stories of loss and grief, and that's incredibly powerful and moving, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And then there's just been friends who I didn't really know much about their life, to be honest, like, and they just shared everything, and it's been like, well, okay, I fully know this person now coming out the other end of it. I'd say the ones with my family members have been really lovely, and we spend a lot of time interacting as a group and not really much time interacting one-on-one, especially with cousins and aunties and uncles. So to be able to sit down with them and actually just ask them about, and it's things that I know because I've grown up with these people, but it's like I didn't know it from their point of view. I've just known my kind of perception of what they were like at school and that kind of thing. So to hear it from them has been incredibly informative and great and lovely in that way. But I think for me as well as that, the best ones are the friends that I've known for quite a while and have the most stories with, because that last part usually is just filled with laughter and getting to the bottom of some things as well. So like, there's trips and nights out and stuff where you're like, well, why did that happen again? And people giving their point of view and perspective on things and going, oh, I had no idea you did this because of this reason. I thought it was because of this. And there's this one story where basically it was our kind of lads holiday at the end of school. So we're all like 18 and we all went out to Malia, which is on one of the Greek islands, this classic UK lads holiday.
Yeah.
And basically the last night of that trip was, we went for 2 weeks and there was 18 of us, so just insane. But the last night of that trip ended up there being this massive brawl, and we ended up with like, quote unquote, the local mafia after us, which was, it is honestly, unless you were there experiencing it, you're like, oh, that's made up. But yeah. It genuinely wasn't. But to get to the bottom of that from the different perspective of about 4 or 5 of us that were involved with that, proper hilarious. Things came out that I was like, oh, I didn't know that had happened, or I'd forgotten about that, or yeah. And that's just one story in among many. But I think just the point is that recounting these stories and reminiscing is just an incredibly fun thing to do. And also, if I ever need a pick-me-up, I have these recordings to go back to, and I know, oh, well, if I go to that one and zoom in, go along a bit towards the end, then I know that this story's going to come up, and, that'll make me laugh. So, it's an impossible question to answer in terms of, all the conversations I've had moments and had really interesting things, whether it's learning something about them, learning about myself, and just the way people have opened up has been incredibly special too.
Mm-hmm. And then just talking about the movement then, obviously we touched on it a moment ago. Where do you want that to go going forward? What do you see as the sort of, is there an end goal?
So I had a moment earlier this year where out of the blue, I got, I think it was an Instagram message from someone in the US who had seen me posting in like a Facebook group about my book and had gone and bought it and read it, really enjoyed it, and then went and had a similar conversation with her auntie.
Right.
And she just wanted to get in touch and say, this has happened and I'm really grateful and thank you and I love, thank you so much, and we both benefited from this conversation. And that was just like a special, okay, cool, job done. This has gone beyond me and my friends now, and it's like, out in the world. So I had that kind of goosebump moment. And so I guess there is no end goal, because it's like just more of those moments would be awesome. But I think to me, the end goal really is this becoming autonomous of me. So a time in the future where I'm not even involved with, the social media or the Eventbrite, and it's totally detached, and someone somewhere else in the world is running an event and I'm not involved at all, and doing that on a semi-regular basis, that to me would be like the ultimate end goal, I guess.
Yeah.
I think what I've been saying to people is the worst case scenario going forward is that I run an event. So I'm moving to Glasgow soon, and I start running an event, say on a monthly basis in Glasgow, and that takes off. And then every now and again, I come back up to Aberdeen and run an event, or maybe I go through to Edinburgh and run an event. That's the worst case scenario. So anything beyond that is a result. And I guess for it to be successful as a movement, it needs to, as I say, become something more than me and my project. And my involvement is, the reason why it exists, but it doesn't need me to function, as an event going forward. So that's really what the movement is about. It's about people kind of taking initiative and wanting to host events and have other people. Because when I say host events, like, I've got some friends who have said to me, "Oh, could I just do this with like my friends and family? It doesn't have to be like a fully public ticketed thing." And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." Like, this could just be a little private thing that you do with, like, you host a dinner and you have your friends participate in some of these activities. Great. Like, the whole point of this is I just want more people to have meaningful, intentional conversations, deepen their connections. And then I guess the high level theory of change, if you like, is that I think that intentional conversations lead to deeper connections, lead to a bit more vulnerability in the world, lead to normalizing chats about struggles that we're having. I don't even want to use the term mental health, because I think it doesn't have to be. I think people jump to like, oh, well, that means crisis. That means like, and it doesn't have to be. It could just be like more honest and vulnerable conversations, and also a lot more appreciation in the world for each other.
Yeah.
As I said, I was living in Canada for the last year up until recently, and I found that people there were a lot more inclined to just kind of show appreciation for one another than we are back home in the UK. I think we're a bit more reserved and kind of awkward in that regard. And so I just want there to be a bit more love and appreciation, I guess. And so, in terms of end goal, I guess the end goal is if this continues to run and flourish beyond me. But for the time being, the worst case scenario is that I'll just run my events and hopefully they take off and I can do that on a pretty regular basis and go from there.
Yeah, sounds great. So I want to finish off with a bit of a takeaway. I mean, the whole thing's been a great takeaway. I've learned a lot, and hopefully a lot of people listening have as well. But are there maybe 3 questions or something that people can get started with? If they want to turn this podcast off at the end, they go and they sit down next to someone, what maybe 3 starter questions, something like that?
Yeah, look, I think I usually kick off with, what were you like as a kid? And people interpret that in slightly different ways. What does kid mean? What age are we talking about? And that's just like open to you to just go in that direction, I guess. But I think it's a really interesting one. It allows people to just it flickers the kind of memories, I guess, immediately. And people having to think back to something that they probably don't give much thought to and actually vocalize it. Maybe it's things that you think about all the time, but you just never talk about with anyone. So, and typically, and not everybody, but typically people have, childhood quite like a enjoyable time for people, and it's a fun thing to talk about. So maybe that as one. I think it's not really a question, but doing you could almost pose it as a question of like, what 3 words would you use to describe me? And doing that is an incredibly powerful thing, because, I mean, it's subjective, right? You could do it on a different day and 3 different words would come to mind. But the point is that you just sit and reflect on what qualities you like about this person, why they're in your life, and being able to actually share that. And not just save it for birthdays or weddings, or, because typically those times we hear these, grand speeches and things, which are beautiful in their own way. But I think just getting that into more kind of day to day, and so maybe that would be one, in terms of asking someone what 3 words would they use to describe you, but being prepared as well to share 3 words back with them. And then, I mean, I've already kind of raised it, but of the podcasts I've done so far, my favorite question so far has been, who in your life makes you laugh regularly? Because then you're just, I mean, automatically you're going to laugh yourself by just thinking about the person in your life that makes you laugh. So like the chat I had with my mate Tash, she brought up her mum and her niece, and make her laugh for very different reasons. And she was just talking about how like her mum's this like sweet little old lady that's so crass, and there's just this, that's incredibly funny. And I was laughing as well, her telling me that. And then it made me think about a friend that I've known for a long time and a friend that I've met more recently, and how they make me laugh in different ways. And then it just leads you on to recounting stories of times that they've made you laugh, and it's just an incredibly positive question and kind of conversation to have. So yeah, I'll go with that. What were you like as a kid? What 3 words would you use to describe me? Who in your life makes you laugh regularly?
Great. 3 great suggestions. So anyone listening can go and ask those, go and have those conversations now. Chris, I think that's a good place to end. So just thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you for being so open and explaining everything in so much depth. It's been really useful, been really insightful for me. If people want to look at what you're doing online, social media, where can they find you?
Yeah, so conversationsmovement.com is the website. On Instagram and LinkedIn, it's that Conversations Movement, or at Conversations Movement. And yeah, just thanks to you for having me on, Sam. It's been a pleasure, and pleasure to chat.
Nice one, thanks. And for us, if you want to find us on Instagram, stay up to date with what we're doing on the podcast, that would be at Lonely Chapter Podcast. And lastly from me, thank you for listening.